Hi, welcome to another session here on the Psychedelic Assisted Therapy Global Summit. My name is Fleet Mull, your co-host for this session, and I'm really happy to be here today with Dr. Bessel. Welcome, Dr. Vanderkolk.
Good to be here.
Well, it's really fabulous to have you. Thank you so much for joining the summit. So I'm going to share a bit of your bio, and then we'll jump right into the conversation. Sound good?
Okay.
Okay. So Bessel Vanderkolk, MD, is a psychiatrist, author, and pioneering researcher in the field of traumatic stress. In 1984, he started one of the first research centers in the U.S. to study and treat traumatic stress in civilians. He did the first studies on the effects of SSRIs on PTSD, was a member of the first neuroimaging team to investigate how trauma changes brain processes, and did the first research linking BPD and deliberate self-injury to early trauma and neglect. He also helped establish the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, a congressionally mandated initiative which funds approximately 150 centers to develop and implement interventions nationwide. Dr. Vanderkolk leads training for mental health professionals, educators, parent groups, policymakers, and law enforcement personnel worldwide. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Body Keeps the Score, which has been translated into 35 languages and of well over 150 peer-reviewed scientific articles. His current research looks at MDMA as a potential treatment for PTSD, as well as its effects on behavior, mood, and executive functioning. So, Dr. Vanderkolk, your book, The Body Keeps the Score, I know so many people just read and reread it, and it's been on the New York Times bestseller list now for incredible 243 weeks. I looked at it last week. It was number one. Yesterday it was number two, but it's been.
We dropped. I'm really
dropped one. Somebody got some book in there, but anyway, I mean that's just incredible. It's spend years as a bestseller, and your work has really transformed how we think about and treat trauma. And so I wondered perhaps we could begin by discussing the nature of trauma and what kind of imprint trauma leaves on both the mind and the body, including the mechanisms by which traumatic experiences can lead to physical, emotional, mental, spiritual dysregulation, illness, and suffering. So I wonder if you could give us just a little introduction to that.
Well, to make a very complex subject as simple as we can, being traumatized really means getting stuck in the fear, terror, and helplessness that you experience at a particular time. And even when the threat itself is over, your system continues to behave and react as if the danger is still going on. And this is not a conscious process. This is not what happens because you're stupid or don't understand that it's over. It's because some core issues in what Antonio Damasio would call the housekeeping of the body change as a result of trauma. And what people hardly ever talk about, which is terribly important, is that trauma, of course, has a profoundly different impact at different stages of human development. Being beaten up or raped as a 1-year-old is a very different experience than being beaten up or raped when you're 45. You have a different brain, different mind, different resources. And so the whole developmental piece is terribly important. And much of our knowledge is very much around learning more and more against considerable opposition, actually, spelling out how trauma at different stages of development in different contexts has a differential effect on mind and brain development, basically.
Mm-hmm. So my understanding is, for many years when we looked at human beings who were struggling in life, years ago, maybe we thought it was a moral issue. They were being punished. Then, it became behavior defects, and then it became, just brain chemistry issues that we can address with SSRIs and so forth. I think today we have a pretty good understanding when we see people in prison, when we see people with various disorders, when we see people experiencing obesity, when we see people really struggling in their life in all kinds of ways, or even acting out in ways that are harmful, what we're really looking at is trauma in one form or another. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, we always try to explain very complex issues, very simple issues. So when I was being trained, the Oedipal conflict explained everything. I flung the course myself, actually, and then it became brain chemistry. But the issue of moral failings hasn't gone away. of course, people are treated all the time, including kids in schools, who are out of control, like they're bad kids and the bad behavior. You're doing this because of me. And I think if people bother to find out how trauma changes people's reactivity, brain, mind, etc., it could make a great deal of difference. But certainly our society as a whole has not really embraced science in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I gave a talk at a major criminal justice conference on juvenile justice. And my basic point of my presentation was that the whole system is still operating with a kind of religious pseudoscience and hasn't really come into the 21st century of science.
But still, and I see it in therapists who do CBT and tell people how their thinking is erroneous and that you should change your thinking. I was like, oh, thank you very much. It was very helpful.
So in this summit, we're exploring psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and the potential it has for changing consciousness, healing trauma, and relieving human suffering in various forms. And so I wonder if you could talk about your understanding of the therapeutic applications of psychedelics and maybe the mechanisms by which some of them are showing promise in healing the underlying traumas with various disorders.
Yeah, my own personal involvement has been twofold. One is for the last almost 10 years now, I've run a psychedelic lab, which is funded by MAPS, where we studied the effect of MDMA on PTSD. And that has been I must say, of all the fascinating things I've studied in my life, that's really been the most fascinating thing we have seen. Really stunningly good results and surprising results in many ways. And the other thing that I've been involved is I've been training mental health professionals, many of them MDs actually, in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And so I get to see what it's like for a clinical population of relatively well put together people to get exposed to psychedelics and to learn about it. And I've learned a lot from that as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what do you feel are the mechanisms by which psychedelics combined with therapy can open the door to healing? I mean, we hear things about repression of the default mode network that opens people up to different states of being and awareness. We hear sometimes people have profound experiences that change their worldview, or perhaps with MDMA, there's just an openness that allows them to enter into a therapeutic conversation more readily.
You know, I hear what I call a lot of biobabble. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, we have the default node network. Oh, we have the polyvagal system. And then we have some vague notion by biology, and people say, now we understand how it works. And in that regard, it's a little bit that we are living in looking at the brains through Galileo's telescope, while in fact we're dealing with an organ that is so infinitely more complex than anything we can measure right now. And I think we should be very careful with our fancy explanations. So what we see clinically, and I think one of the most exciting things about psychedelics is that it may actually bring the mind back into our fields. Can you imagine that? We will actually, again, once understand how people think and what people perceive and how people make sense out of the world, which has not been studied basically for the last 40 years, because molecules took the place of mental phenomena. And the only thing that counts as science is if you can show it in a molecule in a brain scan. But if you look at mental capacities and being able to process information, we need to go back to that. And indeed, psychedelics are showing remarkable capacities to really change one's perception and change one's orientation and how you take in information. One of the most interesting speculations based on pretty good science by a person by the name Gould talks about MDMA possibly opening up critical windows in the mind. So there's a thing that people rarely talk about psychology, very important for my understanding of the clinical work that I do, is that your brain grows and learns certain things at the right time, at the right place. And if you don't learn that at that stage of brain development, your brain can almost not do that anymore. So Hubel and Bessel won the Nobel Prize back in 1953, I think it was, quite a long time ago, about this critical periods of brain development, that if you don't get the right input at the right time, that it's almost impossible to change the perceptual capacities of the brain. And it looks like all of these agents, ayahuasca, ibogaine, MDMA, ketamine, mushrooms, they all have a capacity to open up the mind to take in new information and to process things in a way that is different from anything else that we have been able to know, including relationships. So one of the, to my mind, the most interesting part of the studies in my lab was that what we found is that MDMA has a profound effect on self-compassion, on alexithymia, and on self-regulation and people's relationship to themselves. And actually, quite to my surprise, half of our subjects got placebo plus therapy. I have a very experienced, very good team of therapists who I work with, many of them trained by me. And I would expect that the psychotherapy piece would have more effect on self-compassion and being able to articulate your emotions. And it turned out not to be true. It turned out that the MDMA plus therapy, but oftentimes very few words got spoken during the psychedelic experience, that the psychedelic experience in and of itself, in the right setting, allowed people to really open up their minds in ways that psychotherapy alone seemed to really not be able to hold a candle to, actually. That was interesting because I think most of us still think that the therapeutic relationship and the interaction is the most profound part of psychotherapy. Now, data don't really totally support that. People had warm and safe relationship with their therapists, but it was the drug that really caused these internal transformations in a much more profound way than the therapy alone. And that's really very interesting to me. Yeah.
So I appreciate your reluctance to draw conclusions about what's going on in the brain, the most complex system, I guess, in the known universe. Yeah. And anytime we talk about it, we're in serious danger of being reductionistic and oversimplistic. Right. And yet these are molecules. These psychedelic medicines are molecules, so they are impacting the biology, neurobiology of the brain in some way, and then that's impacting mind, as you say. So from your clinical experience, is that changing anything about how you understand the relationship between the brain, the human brain, and mind and consciousness?
Now, as I said, I'm excited about bringing the mind back in psychiatry. Mm-hmm. And that we have been so completely ignoring mental processes that, yes, you can speculate about the brain, you can speculate the default mode network, but we found that when people are in a dissociative state, the default mode network also goes offline, just like it does in psychedelics. So there's a cute little term, and people will think who don't know much about the brain, say, oh, now we know something, but actually we don't. So everybody now wants to use chemical terms and brain terms because I guess they say they sound smarter if they do. To my mind, they don't sound smarter if you throw the word amygdala around or something like that, More precise clinical observations. Mm-hmm.
So if we do talk about mind and, bring it back into psychiatry, of course, mind has been part of the discussion in psychology of various kinds for a long time, but does that start to take
it hasn't, but not in recent years. I don't hear much talk about the mind and mental development.
Mm-hmm. What about forms of depth? What about forms of depth psychology, so forth? Is there a bridge there between?
Well, there's no research going on that. Huh? Mm-hmm. There's very little research going on how the thinking and the understanding of the world changes between the time you're 2 years old and 3 years old, and it's vast. So we need to go back to really look at people's development and people's moral development and their interpersonal development and their capacity to understand other people around them and to see themselves in perspective. It's time to go back and pay attention to human beings, actually. Yeah. So in the same way that people were sick and tired of psychobabble, when there was too much psychoanalysis. Now I'm sick and tired of biobabble.
Like biobabble.
People you throw these biological terms about, which I happen to be quite familiar with, and I go, yeah, but it doesn't really explain anything.
Yeah, well, I guess we're always looking for reference points to explain what is very mysterious to us still.
Well, and that's what we should look at. Huh? Mm-hmm. And that's what we found, is that that's a core issue. And again, in our publication process, we went into some issues there with viewers because they don't understand that, is that a very big impact of early childhood trauma is that it becomes part of your identity. Mm-hmm. So if you're a molested, abused, and neglected kid, that becomes your identity of I'm an unworthy, I'm a bad person, and that's how you arrange yourself. And psychotherapy has a very poor track record in changing those core identity issues, basically. Mm-hmm. And so what we see remarkably with these psychedelic agents is that people actually get a new perspective on themselves and a new understanding of themselves without anybody putting anything into it. Mm-hmm. It's not like, oh, now I understand how when I was 2 years old, I was molested and that made me feel very bad. But it's not an understanding issue. That doesn't come from outside. The stunning thing about psychedelic agents is that if you provide the right set and setting, that one of the early terms for psychedelics was hyanthothines, self-manifesting drugs. And that's indeed what we find, that they're self-manifesting drugs that allow you to get in touch with part of yourself that has been hidden or pushed away, or in our new book we call it put into the lockbox, had been made inaccessible. And the psychedelics allow people to go there. When people say, it's because it shuts down the amygdala and people are no longer afraid, they go, interesting theory, but I've been plenty scared in my own psychedelic experiences, sometimes going back to some really very painful early events. No, your fear doesn't go away, your pain doesn't go away, but there is something that allows your mind to visit yourself in ways that nothing else that we know of has ever been possible.
Yeah, I watched a lot of the films from MAPS clinical trials and others, and it was really interesting to listen to post-session the client or the patient describe what had been a pretty rough journey, revisiting some very painful things, but they spoke about it with a clearly some shift in perspective. There was some courage and perspective and distance from it, as well as understanding.
More than some. I mean, this is the big deal. This is why it's exciting, that you see things that are extremely painful, but you go, yes, it happened. It's part of me, and it's over. Mm-hmm. And so something changes in the time sense of the brain to be able to know that certain things belong there and not here. And so if you talk about the brain, that clearly is a function of the dorsolateral and medial prefrontal cortex, but we don't have the data really to back that up at this point. Yeah.
Well, let's talk for a minute about memory and the traumatized mind. I want to read something from your 2021 paper. I'm just going to read a couple of sentences on your paper on trauma and memory. This is the quote: "Both my interviews with traumatized people and my brain imaging studies of them seem to confirm that traumatic memories come back as emotional and sensory states with little capacity for verbal representation. This failure to process information on a symbolic level, which is essential for proper categorization and integration with other experiences, is at the very core of the pathology of PTSD." So I'm wondering then if you could talk about the importance of processing or reprocessing traumatic memories, and then how psychedelics appear to be facilitating that.
Again, it's not memories. Huh? I think the field is finally getting that message that before me, Peter Levine already was bringing people's attention. These are sensory experiences. So these are states of minds. Marty Horowitz also talked about it. So not like nobody's ever come to visit me and say, "Oh, I'm coming into treatment with you because I was raped as a 4-year-old." That is, people don't come into therapy because of a memory. People come for treatment because I'm always afraid of physical feelings. Because I get so angry with people who make sexual advances. I get so frozen when I get stirred up by somebody. And so these are all sensory processes in the mind that are not cognitive processes. It's not about memory. And then this issue of repressed memories has still not been laid to rest. And so people, like I give a big program in the Netherlands, and 1.5 million people watched on TV. And there was immediately an article in the newspaper the next day. Dr. Van der Kolk is a dangerous man. He believes in repressed memories. And you go, duh, you know anything about trauma? Trauma is about repressed memories. It's about people not being able to process what happened because it's overwhelming. And then in a very substantial number of people who have no verbal memory for the story of what happened. They just have physical reactions. And so how do we change these physical reactions is the great challenge of treatment. Not to understand the memory or to process the memory, but to really get it to a position where you get to appreciate that these sensations belong to experiences in the past and not to the present. And that's what we see in our psychedelic therapies, that people go to these very dark places. In our study, we are required by the FDA to go for an index trauma, which is a pretty weird thing to do because almost everybody who comes to see us have had multiple traumas in their lives and not just one little incident. And then what you always see in all good treatment life experience is that stuff comes up that people had no idea was there. In my own, as the PI of the study, I had to have my own experiences also. And stuff came up that had been completely locked away from me also. And it was just like, that's what it's like when I was 1 year old. Oh, that's very painful back then. But then once you get to so sensible perspective, that issue belongs to then and not to now. But it's more of a shift in one's orientation in a way.
So you mentioned before I think the power of identity to keep us stuck. Because sometimes it seems like identity is the glue that can really keep us stuck in particular frameworks about beliefs about ourselves and the world, and then somehow these experiences make things more fluid.
Belief is too cognitive. Huh? It's like identity is who I am. I'm a damaged person. Why do you think you're damaged? You look perfectly all right. You're won all kind of prizes as a beauty queen. But I feel damaged. I feel like I'm a bad person. I always blame myself for everything. So it's an orientation.
So it's a deep feeling. It's an embodied kind of feeling. This is who I am. Yeah. And so that with somehow these psychedelic medicines are kind of loosening things up a bit, that maybe that can become more pliable, as well as the nowness of recognizing, okay, that happened, but it's not happened now. These symptoms I'm experiencing are relating to something before, not now.
I think even that's an epiphenomenon. So you have an experience, and because you're an adult, you are able to talk, you can sort of find words for the experience. But I don't think that being able to put it into words is the change agents.
What about pre-verbal traumas?
Well,
how do those become accessed through either psychedelics or therapy so people can release them?
but what I have always come to the conclusion too is that all trauma is pre-verbal trauma. So, because when you are in a trauma, and we did that study, and you couldn't do that study today anymore, because what we did actually, we traumatized people in the scanner. And so people were actually in their terror in the scanner. Nobody would be allowed to do that today for good reasons. But what we learned at that point is that when you are into your trauma on an emotional level, that the whole speech center and the reasonable center of the brain basically goes offline. So when you're in a trauma, you basically have a oh shit experience. Not like, oh, I'm getting raped and it really feels unpleasant, No, you are in a state of horror and shutdown. And so these are not cognitive processes. These are primitive animal type processes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So regardless of chronologically one's age, even if one has language abilities, when the trauma happens, you're not in a cognitive verbal context. So
yeah, basically the capacity to figure things out, to understand it, that's part of what makes things traumatic, is that capacity of your mind to stay in self, to stay focused, to stay attentive, make it wiped out
Mm-hmm.
at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And then afterwards you blame yourself for not being smarter or wiser when it happens, but that's because your brain couldn't handle what's going on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you head up the Boston area MDMA MAPS trials, and we were both recently at the MAPS conference in Denver. It's amazing how this field is growing. Where are the trials? I know they're in the I think the second set of trials and the third stage. Does it look like MDMA may be rescheduled soon? What's your?
Yeah, you were there. You saw it happen, and it was this is a very exciting meeting. Like, how often do you or I go to meetings where we go like, man, there's a new world opening up in front of our faces. And what I was particularly impressed with actually is that both the people who try to make money off psychedelics and the people who are real deep believers in psychedelics and people who believe in the sacred and people in Aboriginal rights and all this, they all came together. Mm-hmm. There was this very wonderful synchronicity of every aspect of society. Some very right-wing financial people were there, some very left-wing hippie type people.
Everybody was there.
That's really the glory of Rick Doblin, that he was able to really bring all these disparate voices together, which is really good. And it's very clear that they are going to be legal before too long. And then what I say to my team is, let's enjoy the honeymoon, because once all this stuff gets commercialized and goes out there, people go to mess up and people go to have side effects. In our study, we didn't have a single side effect. Every one of our subjects did extraordinarily well, which is very unusual for any study. But once you start playing loose ends with the set and setting and with all the preparation and being very cautious, I think things are going to happen that are going to be painful. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it won't create a major backlash. And that seems to be one of the major challenges and conundrums, is how to take this to scale now, because the trials have been done in very structured settings that would be quite expensive to replicate, to get it out at scale. We hear numbers like needing to train 10,000 therapists and things like this.
Yeah, that's of course a very big question. I wish we had more of a discussion about that, because for me, the model is our ketamine trainings, where we have about 30 people who come. We have about 4 faculty members, and people sit for each other. And so we have group sessions. And I think group sessions are probably for ayahuasca is done in groups, mushrooms are being done in groups, ibogaine is being done in groups. I think the group model, if done really well, will make it much more economical, actually. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So wonder if you could talk for a moment about you've been involved in research, clinical practice with both MDMA as part of those MAPS trials and with ketamine. Now, MDMA sometimes is called more of an empathogen than some of the classic, more hallucinatory psychedelics. Ketamine is not a traditional psychedelic, yet certainly can take you to pretty out there places. So I wonder if you could talk about the difference between their modalities and their therapeutic applications.
I would actually like to turn the question around to you, because I'm so puzzled by that. That clearly ayahuasca and mushrooms and ibogaine and MDMA are all very different substances, but the effects seem to be remarkably similar. And I keep bugging my older, not older, but wiser colleagues who know about more of the different substances. So what do you think one is good for versus another? And not a single person has been able to give me a satisfactory answer. Do you have an opinion about it? Just let's.
Well, back in the 60s, I did a little of everything. I lived in Peru and did San Pedro or Wakama for many years. I never did ayahuasca when I was there. It was just the timing. It just never happened. But I've done a lot of LSD and psilocybin and mescaline and mushrooms and all the rest of it. I had never done ketamine before back then, but the only psychedelic I've done in recent years, I hadn't done them for 35 years. And then I went to a retreat that was integrating ketamine with IFS. And I did 3 sessions with ketamine, and it was really incredibly profound. I went there really open to seeing if there was still, residual trauma from my prison experiences. If there was, I lost my son 2.5 years ago. I was just really open to whatever needs to come up, let it come up. And instead, I had 3 experiences that were just all unconditional love and unconditional forgiveness, just kind of bliss and joy, really. But it was very healing. It was profoundly healing. But you also, you wouldn't know, oh, now I want to take ketamine, or I want to take ayahuasca, or now I want to do mushrooms. I think we really don't know, huh? Do we? I don't think we do. I mean, so much of it seems to be set and setting. That seems to be the more powerful component than the particular medicine.
Although the medicines clearly have different effects. Like ketamine is much more of a hallucinogen. In my own experience, the ketamine is mainly of synesthesias. That sounds become colors and colors become sounds, and your whole sensory system gets rewired. On ketamine, I've had no particularly deep revelations of stuff about the past, but something changes. And on MDMA, I had some very clear images, memories, no hallucinogenic effects at all. In some ways, more real, more painful, more cognitive in a way. But which one was better? I don't know.
Well, some people are talking about DMT and then 5-MeO DMT as being the ones that maybe are most closely associated with the neurochemistry of the human brain and seem to take people into these dissolution of self experiences, or these experiences just kind of so beyond that you come back with a pretty radically changed worldview. They seem to be some of the most potent in that regard, it seems, at least from what people have told me.
Well, I've done some of that, and I find them interesting. To the idea of going on a bender for 48 hours, as you would do in ibogaine and ayahuasca, is pretty intimidating. And 5-MeO really allows you to have an experience for 15 minutes. Say, oh, that's what it's like to lose yourself. And so I think it's a very nice, non-threatening introduction to a psychedelic experience. How lasting these things are, of course, we don't know. And there's still so much we have to learn.
So you've been saying that you think it's, although obviously a therapeutic setting can be very helpful in terms of creating the right set and setting, or an appropriate set and setting, and creating the safety, but it's the medicine that's really doing the work in a sense. And so I'm curious what you think about, there's for people dealing with depression, there's these ketamine infusion clinics where there's absolutely no therapy at all. That's one example. On the other hand, talking about integrating it with various forms of therapy that have been used successfully with trauma, like somatic experiencing, sensory motor psychotherapy, EMDR, CBT, IFS, these various modalities.
We had a presentation at a conference combining psychodrama with ketamine. The whole day pre-COVID. It was actually a very lovely experience and very promising. Basically, the way my attitude about it is that our field is filled with religious people. Our field is a religious field, and once you learn a particular method, people say, I'm an EMDR therapist or I'm an IFS therapist, as if you have found a holy grail, as opposed to that you found a method that is very helpful for some people some of the time. And so what I see happen a lot is that people have identified themselves with a particular method and say, now I want to integrate my particular method with psychedelics. And my attitude is, why don't you just open up your mind and learn about psychedelic therapy? And if after you have the experiences and you find that it's lacking something, then add your own particular method to it. But start off with an open mind and leave your religious practices at home where you start going through it.
So then I don't want to nail you down to a particular view, but it sounds like your view is somewhat that the role of the therapist, the clinicians, and psychedelic assisted therapy is primarily to hold a safe space, to create a good set and setting, hold a safe space.
Yeah, we are the guides in people's journey into the deep self, and we are guides and companions like Seer Charon, who would take you to the underworld in the Greek mythology. And we don't give something to people; we are there to accompany people on their journey. Yeah.
So, I've heard you speak about that we all have a kind of inner healer or an inner healing wisdom and intelligence. But we also, many of us also have a pretty raging inner critic. Yep. And so I'm wondering how we navigate that and what psychedelic assisted therapy might have in relation to that.
Well, you went to the IFS plus ketamine retreat. So you know from your own experience that in these substances, your parts of you, the components of yourself, do become quite rapidly manifest themselves, whether you have an IFS background or not, almost. You get to see a part of yourself that's like 1-year-old that still feels very damaged, and a part of you that's a beautiful adolescent at some point. And so you get to really see these aspects of yourself with a certain degree of wonder. And wonder is a wonderful thing, and a certain degree of wow, I did not know this about myself. So it's really this astounding capacity for self-discovery, but also discovery of yourself in the context of other people. This is not doing psychedelics is not a narcissistic enterprise to just take care of you, but you really also get a much deeper appreciation who you are in relationship to creatures around you in some ways. And I think that makes these retreats like the one that you went through, which I imagine I know which one it was, that makes it the very intimate experiences, or that people get a much deeper sense of compassion and tolerance of themselves, but also of the people around them. And in these retreats, I see an enormous amount of kindness and openness oftentimes.
Yeah, I think that it was a very bonding experience for me in that retreat with the group we were with. And, I remember some of my early psychedelic experiences back in the 60s and 70s that seemed to really change things for me, change my worldview, had to do with experiencing a profound sense of interconnectedness with all of life, all of the natural world, of no longer kind of dividing the world into animate and inanimate, that it was all this energetic world that I was part of and participating in. And yet those were back then, I mean, there was some sharing of those experiences, but most of it was kind of done on my own or with somebody else. There wasn't like a structured sharing circle. And so it does seem that the element you were talking about before, like we often say therapy, the important thing is the relationship.
Yeah.
But with the medicines, there does seem to be some relationality to the experience of opening up to a profound relationality with the universe. And then coming back and, as you said, doing this in group work, being able to share in circles seems to be a way to bring that experience back into the relative world that we live in.
Yeah, I think it has a profound effect on, I still have patients who I've seen quite a long time who still say, that's not normal. And I say, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, I guess. Yeah, I don't know any normal people, so I don't quite know what is normal, actually. But the sense, I think big thing that I wish I had talked more about at the MAPS conference is the issue of shame.
Mm-hmm.
And how basically, as I look back on my own psychoanalysis as a youngish adult in my early 30s, I was just lying there on the couch thinking every second, am I good enough? Does he like what I say? Am I smart enough? Does he think I'm an asshole? And basically, I spent 2.5 years lying in shame, wondering whether what I was doing was good enough. And that's one thing about these psychedelic agents, is that the issue of shame and embarrassment really goes away. And so you see things for what they are. You see yourself for who you are. And like I had the experience the past few years of experiencing myself. I was born in 1943, and my generation has been studied thoroughly as a civilian population starved to death. And so a very large number of kids my age died in my first year of my life. And I really got in touch with what a very scared, sickly, almost dead little child I was. And it's a painful experience, but also I got, that's what happened. That's what you carry inside, you poor kid. And it must have been hard that your parents didn't know how to help this little kid either. And so you get a perspective that is really understanding, forgiving, and accepting, like, this is what really happened. And it happened back then, and it's a miracle that I survived. And this deep sense, and then that means that's not only true for me, it's true for you. And that you are a person who probably went through experiences that you barely survived and are etched on you. And so in some ways, we're all in similar boats. It's not you are normal and I'm crazy. No, we all have had multiple challenges that we carry with us that have shaped us and that are worthy of our attention in ourselves and the people around us. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the title of Gabor Mate's wonderful new book is something about the myth of normal or something.
Right.
Yeah, very important idea. You brought up shame, and my work in the criminal justice system focuses a lot on that. And, I feel like culturally and societally, we have a lot of reinforcement for shame, and can even see shame as a positive tool. There's notions of positive shame that underlie penology or the philosophy of incarceration. And
don't have shameless people, do we?
Yeah. And I
just support the emotion,
Yeah. To me, shame is, if I understand it, for me, I've always understood as shame as being the emotion we feel when love is withdrawn, or the threat of love being drawn, connection being withdrawn. We're not worthy, that communication and we're not worthy. Yeah. And it seems like to me, that's always going to be toxic for an individual. And it seems like there's so much of it in our society and some of our religious traditions. I think some of the misunderstanding of some of the theological positions of our religious traditions.
Yeah, and it's in every society. And it's not only true in our American Western society. You see the same thing in Africa. You see the same thing in India, the same thing in China. It's a universal issue, that feeling of not being good enough and trying to hide yourself, actually.
So I'm wondering if, we're in this, along with this very rapidly emerging field of psychedelic psychotherapy, we're in this, what's being called kind of a psychedelic renaissance. And of course, many of us thought back in the 60s psychedelics were going to change the world, and they did to some degree. But then there was a huge backlash and things got shut down. It seems like people are approaching it in a much more thoughtful way now. I mean, there's a lot of craziness, I'm sure, going on, but still, there's so many nonprofits and organizations. I've been doing a lot of research. It seems to be people are much more thoughtful. And as you mentioned, even in terms of psychiatry and medicine, this could be kind of a heyday of openness and being willing to be back in the world of really pure science, not knowing, exploration and openness and curiosity and so forth. So I'm just wondering about if you see some possibilities of social change coming out of this.
Yeah, the possibility is certainly there. Again, you and I are old enough to be part of that last revolution also. Mm-hmm. And my team, who are sort of in their good middle 40s, early 50s now, we're not part of this. Say, oh, we're part of the revolution. I go, yeah, and I used to be part of the first revolution also. And boy, did we think we're going to change the world? And we didn't, and so I'm very curious what will happen this time. But I'm not making any predictions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned before that in your clinical, in the trials with MDMA in Boston area, the lab you're running, that you haven't had any deleterious impacts. So I wonder if you could point to what are some of the key things that you feel have prevented that. What are the key things that you focus on with the way your trials are being managed and supervised that you feel is leading to good results and avoiding some of the problems that could arise?
No, I think the word that we cannot avoid using, but of course we cannot use it when we talk about science, is the word sacred. Mm-hmm. And in the same way that you mentioned the issue of universality and the feeling that all things are connected with each other, mm-hmm. You cannot talk about psychedelics without talking about that phenomenon that on psychedelics people understand the interrelationship between us and things, etc., on a much deeper level. And I think the other thing that is very central in the psychedelic world is the creation of sacred spaces. And that means the right music, the right light, the right sound, and the knowledge that somebody is going to be there for me every second of my experience. This person is going to be totally committed to being with me regardless of what comes up. And indeed, oftentimes very, very painful things come up, and you better like and trust the people who are sitting with you, because otherwise we'll get contaminated. My team is just a team of very lovely and thoughtful people, and I'm in a way not surprised that we had no side effects, because these are the sort of people who you and I and most people I know we just really enjoy being with, because they're gentle and kind and thoughtful people. And things need to be predictable. And trauma is about sudden things suddenly happening, and that means you really create a space that is very predictable, where you have a lot of control of what's going on, and somebody is with you completely there for you at all times. Mm-hmm. Not trying to correct your faulty thinking. Yeah, mm-hmm. Like I heard somebody at the conference. Somebody was saying, there was a black person who went through a psychedelic experience, and he went into Black Lives Matter, and his therapist said, all lives matter.
Oh boy.
It's the wrong thing to say at that particular point, even though it's true, Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's completely out of context and tone deaf to the situation. So, obviously in research, cleaving close to the data, respecting the scientific meta, it's really important for research to progress. And at the same time, it seems like psychedelic research inevitably takes us kind of into the boundaries of the physical and the metaphysical, the world of science and data, and the kind of like what you were referencing with the sacred. It seems to inevitably it takes us into pushing the boundaries a little bit of science into the.
Well, I don't see that all that much because, I have worked in laboratories since I was a medical student or before I was a medical student, and I've always sort of seen laboratories as sacred spaces.
Mm-hmm.
As that's where you come and really you wash your hands and you wear your coat and you wear your goggles and you do all your things and you completely devote yourself to the enterprise in a non-selfish way, in a way. And so in some ways, I think psychedelic therapy is very much like doing a scientific experiment. You don't know what the outcome is going to be, just like in scientific experiments. And in some ways, it doesn't matter what the outcome is. What's interesting is the search and the questions you ask that come up,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. The image, as you were describing the laboratory, your experience in a laboratory as a sacred space, it really struck me. That's really quite interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way before. Yeah, absolutely. So, Dr. Van Kolk, I wonder if there are any other thoughts you'd like to share just about where psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is going in its relation to trauma therapy, which you've been a leader in that field for so long, and just any.
Well, the one issue that I like to bring up, and I brought it up again in Denver this past week, is that we may be studying the wrong thing. And there's a big millstone around our neck in our field, and that's the DSM. And that people get defined by DSM diagnoses, which really have no scientific validity and that really don't predict what people need or what's necessary for people. And so I'm really encouraging people to really pay much more attention not to DSM type categories of how messed up you are, but like, how do you see the world? Who are you? What did you discover? How do you see the world differently? I did Rorschach tests before and after Prozac. I did the first study on Prozac for PTSD. And these are data I never published, and I now really regret not publishing, because what we saw at this point is that even on Prozac, people on the Rorschach changed their perceptions of the world very dramatically. And I think that that really paying attention to how we process information and how we change and how we change our relationship to ourselves and to each other is something that needs much more attention, and that's scientific attention. The only way, putting people in the scanner is not the only way to do science, actually. Like giving people a Rorschach can also be science,
So it would seem like leaving the DSM manual behind would be a very helpful thing for humanity and psychology and psychiatry, at least to some degree. I'm curious about, we're experiencing this interplay between traditional forms of plant medicine and the way they're offered in ceremony by shamans and curanderos and sitters, and then now how it's being worked with in laboratories. And so not that you can conflate the role of the physician or the psychiatrist or the psychologist and the shaman, but I wonder if there's anything going on that we're seeing that might be opening up how we see the role of clinicians, healers. I mean, even for Western doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, if they're in some might be moving into a more reflective state. What does it mean to be a healer? And is there any information coming from the traditional world?
Yeah, I think these are very important questions. And since you and I are about the same age, you didn't go to medical school, did you?
No.
But I feel that I was trained as a medical student, which was not that long after the invention of penicillin, that being a physician is a sacred job in a way. I think that was very much my training. And I think that the mention of productivity, 7 minutes per patient, reliance on drugs only to treat people have really destroyed some of the soul of our profession. Mm-hmm. And I think that indeed using plant medicines may get us back in touch with what it's like to be a healer.
Mhm.
And to really redefine ourselves as healers in very profound ways. As long as you do CBT with people and you try to change their stupid way of thinking, that's not exactly a very sacred ceremony that you do. But once you get to understand how much capacities people have inside of themselves to rearrange themselves, and that you can be a facilitator of that process, you get back into the position that you are as a facilitator and somebody who helps people to enter that sacred space. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a good place to bring our conversation to a cclose. Thank you so much, Dr. Van.
Thank you. It's really good talking with you.
Yeah, really good talking with you. Thank you so much for your work and your contributions. Thank you.